The morning light shone through the yellowed curtains of my living room, revealing the pictures on the wall. Each one was a shard of a past life when Alma was around. I stared at her smile behind the glass frame and involuntarily touched my own face with wrinkled fingers, as if trying to find the young man she had once loved. I'm 73, and my name is Weston Pemberton. I once taught philosophy at a local college, but I've spent the last 8 years alone, struggling with the void Alma left behind. A small house on the outskirts of Leander I'd built with my own hands when we were young. Now it has become a witness to my slow fading. Books everywhere, my faithful friends, the only ones who hadn't left me in my old age. Alma always grumbled that I was turning the house into a library, but she was secretly proud of my erudition. My bookworm, she'd say, kissing me gently on the forehead as I fell asleep over the next volume. I rose from my chair, feeling the familiar ache in my knees. Age is a merciless thing. I walked slowly to the kitchen and put the kettle on. My movements had been practiced for years. Take out an old porcelain cup, put in a tea bag, pour boiling water. Simple actions that created the illusion of habit and constancy in a world that had long ago lost its meaning for me. Outside the window, I could see the Bridges family's neighbor's house. Their young daughter Abby often came to me to listen to stories about the ancient philosophers. I would retell Plato's dialogues to her in the form of fairy tales, and she would look at me with wide-open eyes that reflected sincere admiration. Perhaps these visits were the only thing that truly brightened my days. If only my own son had looked at me the same way as a child. Keaton, my only son, whom everyone just calls Keith, has always been a mystery to me. How could Alma and I, people who valued books, ideas, and simple joys, have produced such a practical and cold creature? Keith grew up believing that success in life was measured solely by material achievements. He is now 45. He works as a corporate strategy consultant for an urban firm. I can't say that his career has been brilliant, but he has always strived to give the impression of being extremely successful. I remember as a teenager, he was ashamed of my profession. "Dad's just babbling about dead Greeks," he used to say contemptuously to his friends, thinking I couldn't hear. I guess I should have been tougher on him. Alma always said I was too soft. "You live in a world of ideas, Weston, and a boy needs boundaries in the real world." But I couldn't bring myself to be hard on my only son, especially after he lost his mother when he was 8. 3 years ago, Keith married Violet Hyde. I remember their wedding, a modest ceremony to which I was invited more out of a sense of duty than a desire to see. Violet. Even her name seemed insincere to me. Bright as a picture from a fashion magazine, she worked in the beauty industry, advising wealthy clients on image. A sharp tongue, an ever-evaluating gaze, and a smile that never reached her eyes were what I saw every time we rarely met. I watched as she systematically alienated my son from me. "Weston is so old-fashioned," she would say to Keith, thinking I couldn't hear. Or better yet, "Your dad's nice, but a little, out of step with the times." After we got married, our visits became even less frequent. Keith used to visit me at least once a month, but now I only saw him on holidays and not always. The last time they came was Christmas. Violet walked around my house, touching dusty shelves with her finger and making remarks about the smell of old age. "Dad, you should think about a nursing home," Keith said then, not looking me in the eye. "Violet and I could help you find something suitable." "Something inexpensive," Violet added immediately. "In your position, you can't throw money around." My situation. They made it sound like I had one foot in the grave. I turned them down, saying I was doing just fine on my own. Keith looked annoyed, and something like disappointment flashed in Violet's eyes. Later, I realized that they were hoping to sell the house and maybe get their hands on the proceeds. My house is the only thing of value I have. Or rather, that's what I thought until yesterday. I took a sip of my cool tea and glanced at the white envelope on the table. It had come yesterday, and its contents had turned my life upside down. The letter was from Roland Pierce, attorney for my old friend Edmund Rochester. Edmund and I had met in graduate school. He was studying literary history, I was studying philosophy. We shared a love of books and long intellectual conversations. After graduation, our paths diverged. I stayed on to teach at a small college, and he had a brilliant career at a university on the East Coast. We kept in touch, exchanging letters and occasionally meeting at conferences. Edmund never married, devoting himself entirely to science and collecting rare editions. 3 months ago, I learned of his death from a short obituary in a professional journal. Edmund was 78, and I assumed he had gone in his typical manner, quietly without fuss, leaving behind only his books and articles. And now this letter. I reread it again. Dear Mr. Pemberton, I regret to inform you of the death of Professor Edmund Rochester on the 3rd of April this year. In fulfillment of the deceased's will as set forth in his will, I notify you that Professor Rochester bequeathed to you his personal collection of first editions of 19th century British poetry, comprising 37 volumes. In accordance with the deceased's wishes, the collection will be delivered to your address within 1 month of receipt of your written confirmation of your willingness to accept the bequest. Please contact my office at the contact information below for details of the transfer. Sincerely, Roland Pierce, Executor. I set the letter aside and walked to the window. In 30 years of teaching, I had developed the habit of pondering new information while looking out at the horizon. Edmund was always bragging about his collection, but I had never seen it in its entirety. Only a few volumes that he sometimes brought to conferences to show his colleagues. Even these individual copies were impressive. Handmade leather bindings, gold embossing, perfect preservation. 37 volumes of first editions. I was not an expert in book rarities, but even to me it was clear that such a collection must be worth a lot of money. Probably a lot of money. The thought made me swallow nervously. All my life I had lived modestly. The salary of a provincial college professor had never been high, and my pension made every dollar count. I was used to such an existence and had no complaints. But now, I looked at Alma's picture. What would she say? Probably she would have laughed her sonorous laugh. See, Weston, your love of books has finally paid off. My musings were interrupted by a phone call. Keith's number. Strange, he usually only called on Sundays, and not every week. Dad, his voice sounded unusually cheerful. How are you? Not bad, thanks, I answered cautiously, surprised by his sudden interest in my health. Listen, Violet and I were thinking, my birthday's coming up. Why don't we go out to dinner? I know a good restaurant downtown. Keith's birthday. I remembered it was May 25th, but we usually just talked on the phone and mailed in a gift card. Do you want to go to a restaurant? The three of us? I asked, not hiding my surprise. Yes, it would be fun to spend time together, he said, a hint of impatience in his voice. You don't get out of your house much. A change of scenery would do you good. Something about the sudden invitation felt insincere, but I couldn't refuse. After all, it's the birthday of my only son. All right, Keith. When and where? Next Friday, 7 p.m. I'll email you the address. After that, he quickly said goodbye, citing his busy schedule. I hung up the phone and went back to my chair. Something had changed in Keith's way of speaking. Usually he spoke to me condescendingly, with barely concealed impatience, like a cranky child. Today his voice sounded almost ingratiating. My gaze fell on the letter again. Had Keith found out about the inheritance? But how? I hadn't told anyone about the letter, hadn't even called the solicitor yet. Coincidence? Maybe. I decided to call Roland Pierce today. I needed to know more about the collection before I met with Keith and Violet. Something told me the information might be useful. Alma always said I was too trusting. You only see the good in people, Weston, and that's your weakness. Maybe she was right. But with age comes, if not wisdom, at least caution. And now my intuition was telling me that I should be cautious in my dealings with my son. I carefully folded the letter back into the envelope and hid it between the pages of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, a book Keith would never open. Then I dialed the number on the letter. I had an important conversation to have. In the morning, I called Roland Pierce's office. The conversation was brief but informative. The solicitor confirmed that the Edmund collection was ready for shipment and would arrive within 2 weeks. To my cautious question about the value of the books, Roland replied discreetly, Professor Rochester never viewed his collection as an investment, Mr. Pemberton. For him, it was a passion. However, if you are interested in the material aspect, I can recommend you consult a rare edition specialist. I sat for a long time after the conversation, pondering the strange coincidence. Keith's invitation to dinner had come too soon after the letter about the inheritance. But how could he have known? I hadn't told anyone. Perhaps it really is just a coincidence, and I'm getting too suspicious in my old age. The days before the appointment stretched slowly. I decided to call Irene Foster, a former colleague who, after retirement, had taken a job as a consultant at an antiquarian bookstore. We hadn't spoken in over a year, and her surprise at my call was almost palpable. "Weston, what a pleasant surprise. How are you doing, you old bookworm?" Her warm voice made me smile. We exchanged news, and I, trying to speak casually, mentioned Edmund's inheritance. "Shummer, Rochester?" Irene perked up. Of course I'd heard about his collection. It was legendary in academic circles. The first edition of Wordsworth's and Coleridge's lyrical ballads, Keats's poems of 1817. If all this is true, you've come into possession of a real treasure. "So valuable?" I asked, trying to hide my excitement. "My dear," Irene sounded genuinely amazed. "Such collections usually sell for 6 figures at auction, sometimes more." I swallowed, feeling my mouth dry. 6 figures? The kind of money I'd never seen in my entire life. "But I'd advise you to take your time," Irene continued. "When the books arrive, let's meet. I'll help you figure out what's what." After talking to her, I thought about my financial situation. My pension was $2,300 a month. After utilities, insurance, and medications, there wasn't much left over. For the last few years, I had been saving literally on everything, denying myself even small pleasures, like going to the movies or buying a new shirt. And now fate has given me this gift, a collection that could solve all my financial problems overnight. But with it came anxiety. If the books are really worth that much, won't they attract unwanted attention? Particularly the attention of my son and his wife, who had always taken a morbid interest in my finances, with little or no interest in my life. I glanced at Alma's picture. "What would your advice be, dear?" I mentally asked. It seemed to me that her smile had become a little sadder. She had always been pragmatic, my Alma. "Think of yourself, Weston," I thought I heard her voice say. "For once in your life." With those thoughts in mind, I headed to the mall to pick up a gift for Keith. My son's birthday always gave me mixed feelings. On the one hand, it was an occasion to show him that I cared and remembered important dates. On the other hand, each year I found it harder and harder to find a gift that he would like. Keith had long since grown out of the books and mind games I had given him as a child. His tastes had become material. At the jewelry store, I stopped in front of a display case of cufflinks. A silver pair with small sapphires caught my eye. Elegant, but not flashy. The price made me wince. $199, almost a tenth of my monthly income. "Can I show you something, sir?" The saleswoman, a young girl with a friendly smile, approached me. "Yes, these cufflinks, please." She took them out of the display case and placed them on a velvet cushion. "Excellent choice. Sterling silver, natural sapphires. The perfect gift for a special occasion." I took the cufflinks in my hands, imagining Keith wearing them to one of his business meetings. Would he think of me? Would he remember where they came from? "I'll take them," I said, pulling out my credit card. "Would you like a gift wrap?" the girl asked. "It's free for purchases like this." "Yes, please." She carefully placed the cufflinks in a small box wrapped in blue paper with a silver bow. "Who's the gift for, if it's no secret?" she asked, handing me the package. "For my son. It's his birthday." "He'll be thrilled," she said confidently. I only nodded, not having the heart to dissuade her. If she'd known Keith, she would have realized that cufflinks, even with sapphires, would hardly excite him. But what else could I get him? Leaving the store, I went into a cafe and ordered a cup of tea. I had to think about dinner. Keith had emailed me the address of the restaurant, so I decided to study the menu on their website beforehand. What I saw made me go cold. The average check was $80 per person, not including alcohol. If the three of us had dinner, with wine and desserts, the bill would easily exceed $300. I pressed the bridge of my nose with my fingers, trying to focus. In my position, such an expense was an unreasonable luxury, but to decline the invitation meant ruining my relationship with my son, possibly forever. Besides, it was his birthday. How could I say no? When I got home, the first thing I did was check my bank account. After buying the cufflinks, there was a little over $1,100 left. That should be enough to buy dinner and still have enough left over for necessary expenses until my next retirement, if you save a lot of money. I sat back in my chair, feeling fatigue pile up on my shoulders. Why had the relationship with my own son become such an ordeal? When had it started? Maybe when Alma died and I, immersed in my own grief, couldn't give him the support he needed. Or earlier, when I refused to pay for him to attend a prestigious university, believing that community college was just as good. Or was it that I had never been the kind of father he wanted? Successful, rich, powerful? I thought back to his childhood years. Keith had been an inquisitive boy with a lively mind and a kind heart. How did he turn into this cold, calculating man? And was I to blame for this transformation? Maybe this dinner is a chance to set things right. Maybe over good wine, in a pleasant atmosphere, we can find common ground. After all, we are each other's only family. The next few days were spent in preparation. I took my only decent suit to the dry cleaners, bought a new shirt and tie, spent an hour shining my old shoes. I got a haircut at a cheap barber shop. All the while, I had a strange sense of anticipation mixed with anxiety. Thursday night, the phone rang. Keith's number. "Dad," he sounded unusually cheerful. "I wanted to check in about tomorrow. Do you remember we're meeting at 7? "Of course I remember," I answered. "Côte d'Azur, 7 o'clock. "Great," said a woman's voice, and Keith covered the microphone with his hand. A few seconds later, he came back to the conversation. "Violet asked if you're going to wear anything, something decent?" I felt the color rush to my face. "I have a suit, Keith." Okay, he was clearly uncomfortable. "It's just that this is a pretty fancy place, and Violet's worried about the impression we'll make." We, like I was part of their couple, not a separate person with my own dignity. "Don't worry," I said, trying to speak calmly. "I won't embarrass you." "Dad, that's not what I meant," Keith protested, but without much enthusiasm. "It's all right. I'll see you tomorrow." I hung up the phone, feeling a wave of bitterness rising inside me. Even at a time like this, they couldn't resist humiliating me. Decent, like I'm a hobo who doesn't know how to dress for going out in society. Friday morning greeted me with a headache and heaviness in my chest. I didn't sleep well, tossing and turning until 3 in the morning, tormented by thoughts of my upcoming meeting. At 9, I forced myself to get up and make breakfast, a simple oatmeal with half a banana. I had no appetite, but I knew I had to eat to take my medication. The day stretched agonizingly slow. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus on the text. I turned on the TV, but the meaningless noise only annoyed me. Finally, I decided to just walk around the neighborhood, hoping the fresh air would clear my thoughts. The weather was beautiful, a warm May day with a slight breeze. The blossoming trees filled the air with a delicate fragrance. I walked down familiar streets, greeting neighbors, stopping to pet friendly dogs. This ordinariness was soothing. As I passed a playground, I noticed a little boy building a sandcastle. His father sat nearby, helping to reinforce the walls. They were laughing, engrossed in their joint creation. This scene gave me a painful prick of envy. Had I ever been that kind of father to Keith? Had I ever made time for simple pleasures? Or was I always immersed in my books and lectures? When I got home, I began to get ready for the evening. I showered, shaved thoroughly, even used the aftershave Keith had given me last Christmas that I'd been saving for special occasions. Put on a new shirt, suit, tie, looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the man who looked back at me from there, a hunched old man with frightened eyes. "Straighten up, Weston," I said, as if I heard Alma's voice. "You're still the man I loved." I squared my shoulders, adjusted my tie, and smiled at my reflection. I may not be rich, I may not have reached the heights I dreamed of when I was young, but I've lived an honest life, and I have no reason to be ashamed. At 6 o'clock and 30 minutes, I hailed a cab. The ride to the restaurant was about 20 minutes, but I preferred to arrive early. Besides, public transportation was irregular in the evening, and being late would only add to Keith and Violet's criticism. Sitting in the back of the cab, I stared out the window at the city and thought about what awaited me that evening. Part of me hoped for reconciliation, for a warm conversation, for a restoration of the bond that had once been between my son and me. The other part, the more cynical part, expected another dose of condescension and covert ridicule. In my jacket pocket was a gift box of cufflinks, a small symbol that I still cared about my son, still wanted to be a part of his life. The cab pulled up in front of the restaurant. I paid the driver, leaving a generous tip, a small luxury I could afford that evening. I took a deep breath, gathering my composure, and headed for the entrance to the Azure. I stood for a moment in front of the restaurant doors, looking at the elegant people sitting at the tables by the windows. They seemed like inhabitants of another world, a world to which I had never belonged. But tonight I would enter that world. For Keith. For the hope that not all is lost between us. With that thought, I pushed open the door and stepped into the brightly lit space of the restaurant, where I was waiting for what could either be the beginning of a new phase in our relationship or the last straw that would be the last straw in my patience. The Azure restaurant was much more pretentious than I had expected. The huge windows overlooked the river, reflecting the city lights. Waiters in starched shirts glided between tables with the look of people initiated into some mystery. The interior was full of details designed to speak of luxury: heavy velvet drapes, crystal chandeliers, porcelain vases with fanciful compositions of fresh flowers. I shuddered, imagining the kind of bill this place might bring. Even the new navy blue suit I'd bought especially for this evening suddenly seemed out of place amid all the glitter. I tightened the knot of my tie and squared my shoulders, trying to look more confident than I actually felt. The maitre d', a young man with pomaded hair and a condescending smile, greeted me at the entrance. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" "Yes, under the name of Pemberton, or rather Keaton Pemberton. I'm his father," I explained, noticing the maitre d's glance at my worn shoes. "Of course you are. Your son and his wife have arrived. Let me show you out." I followed him through the spacious hall. Many questions arose in my mind. Why were Keith and Violet early? They were usually late for our rare meetings. And why this particular restaurant? As far as I knew, Keith's financial situation didn't allow him to visit such places regularly. They were sitting at a corner table, talking animatedly. Violet looked stunning in a burgundy-colored dress with perfect hair and makeup. Keith, in a new suit that I was sure cost half my monthly pension, seemed to radiate self-assurance. When they saw me, they both smiled strainedly. "Dad!" Keith stood up and hugged me awkwardly. He smelled of expensive cologne and alcohol. "Glad you could make it." "Happy birthday, son." I handed him a small box wrapped in plain blue paper. "What's this?" Keith took the gift with ill-concealed disappointment. "Cufflinks," I answered. "They're silver with sapphires." Violet laughed softly and sipped from her champagne glass. "How nice," she said. I affirmed. Vintage accessories are coming back into fashion, although for Keith's clients, modernity is more important. "Thanks, Dad." Keith put the box down beside him without even opening it. "Have a seat. We've already ordered appetizers and wine." I sank into a chair, feeling slightly irritated. They hadn't even waited for me to order. And judging by the half-empty bottle of expensive wine on the table, they'd started celebrating long before I arrived. "How's your health, Weston?" Violet asked, eyeing me like a museum piece. "You look chipper for your age." "Thank you, Violet. I'm perfectly fine." "You are?" She leaned forward. "You know, there are some great senior centers. A client of mine recently put her mother in one. She says great care, lots of activities for your, generation." "I prefer my own home," I replied discreetly. Of course you do," Violet exchanged a quick glance with Keith. "It's just that sometimes you have to look ahead. Plan, so to speak." I could see where they were going with this, but I decided to change the subject. "So Keith, 45 years old. That's a respectable age. Any special plans?" My son straightened up, adjusting his tie. "Actually, yes. I'm negotiating a partnership with a major consulting firm. If everything works out, Violet and I are thinking about buying a house in the suburbs. Something a little more, spacious." "Sounds ambitious," I said, trying not to sound skeptical. Keith had always exaggerated his prospects. "It's time to think big." Violet stepped in. "Keith deserves better. He has labored in the shadow of others for so many years." The waiter brought appetizers, tiny portions of some exotic dish decorated with edible flowers. I could barely recognize the ingredients, but the prices on the menu I was handed were more than recognizable, astronomical. "And how's your job, Violet?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "Still doing image consulting?" She smiled indulgently. "I'm not just a consultant anymore, Weston. I've opened my own style studio. I already have 5 employees and A-list clients. I'm being interviewed for Style magazine next month. That's impressive, I nodded. Yeah, Keith and I are working hard on our future. Violet looked at my son meaningfully. By the way, Keith, tell your father about that offer from Edwards. Keith cleared his throat and poured himself some wine. Yeah, I'll probably get a contract to restructure their sales department. A 6-figure sum, Dad. I nodded silently, wondering why they were trying so hard to impress me. I'd gotten used to Keith's bragging over the years, but today it seemed especially insistent. The main courses arrived. My chop was cooked perfectly, but it was the size of a postage stamp on a huge white plate. Apparently, in this restaurant, you don't pay for quantity, but for finesse. So, Dad, Keith began after a few minutes of awkward silence, you said you had some news? That was it. Now I understood the reason for this dinner. Somehow they had got wind of the letter from Edmund's solicitor. But how? Perhaps Keith had seen the envelope when he'd stopped by my place last week to check on my progress. He didn't usually show such concern. News? I pretended I didn't know what he was talking about. Yeah, you got some important letter, didn't you? Keith insisted, not hiding his impatience. I slowly cut off a piece of meat and put it in my mouth, chewing it thoroughly. Let them be a little nervous. Oh, that's what you mean. Yes, an old friend left me something as a legacy. It's nothing special, just a memory. Violet moved forward, keeping her eyes on me. Friend? What friend? Edmund Rochester. We were students together many years ago. He was a professor of literature. And what did he leave you? Keith asked, trying to sound casual, but I could see the tension in his eyes. A few books. Edmund was a collector. Books, Violet repeated with ill-concealed disappointment. How's that? Your style? Yes, I shrugged. But some of them are quite rare. First editions of 19th century British poets. Kit and Violet exchanged quick glances. First editions? Keith said cautiously. They might be of some value, wouldn't they? Perhaps, I took a sip of wine. I haven't studied the matter in detail yet. The atmosphere at the table had changed. I could almost physically feel the gears turning in the heads of my companions, calculating the potential value of the inheritance. You should see an expert, Violet said with sudden concern in her voice. I have a client who deals in antiques. He could appraise the collection. Better yet, Keith said, we could help you sell it. You know, at your age, you could use the extra money. For medical expenses and stuff. That's very thoughtful of you, I said dryly. The desserts arrived, some intricate constructions of chocolate and fruit. Keith and Violet no longer hid their interest. How many volumes are there in this collection? Keith asked, tapping his fingers impatiently on the table. 37. 37, Violet said, and I could almost see the dollars flickering in her pupils. All first editions? That could be worth a significant amount of money. I'm a conservative person, Violet, I replied. I might just save them for future generations. But why? Keith exclaimed. Those books will just sit in the dust in your house. No one will ever see them. I will see them, I said calmly. Books are not just commodities to me. Keith finished his wine in one gulp and set the glass down abruptly. Dad, be realistic. You live on a pension that barely pays the bills, and now you have the opportunity to have a comfortable old age. Or, he paused meaningfully, help your family, that's it. The cards are finally laid bare. Your family? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Yes, Violet interjected. Keith is your only son. Isn't it natural that you'd want to support him? We're planning a big future, a new home, maybe even children. Children? In 3 years of marriage, they've never once mentioned wanting children. Moreover, Violet had always struck me as a woman who valued career over family. That's an interesting perspective, I said neutrally. I didn't know you were thinking about procreation. We think about a lot of things, Keith leaned forward, but it takes resources. And if these books are really valuable, the waiter brought the bill in a small leather folder. Keith didn't even look at it, just pushed it aside for me. Do you mind, Dad? After all, it's your birthday present to me. He smiled, and there was no warmth or gratitude in that smile. I opened the folder and couldn't hold back a sigh. The amount was almost equal to half of my monthly pension, but I pulled out my old credit card and put it on the account. I didn't want to ruin the evening by arguing about money. Keith noticed my confusion and smiled even wider. Yeah, the prices here are a little steep, but you can afford it, right? Especially with this new inheritance. I haven't gotten the books yet, I reminded him. I haven't appraised their value. But you'll sell them, won't you? Keith insisted. It's the sensible thing to do. I hadn't decided yet. Violet let out a short laugh. Weston, be practical. What will you do with the rare books? Read them before bed? They're supposed to be useful. The waiter returned with my card and check. I signed it, trying not to think about having to save money for the next month. Benefit to whom? I asked, looking up at Violet. All of us, of course, she said with a wave of her hand. The family. Keith nodded, supporting his wife. Dad, let's face it. You're 73. How much longer are you going to live? 10 years? 15 at best. And Violet and I are just starting our lives. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not from the pain, but from the realization that my son is counting the days until I die. My inheritance. What do you suggest? I asked quietly. Sell the books now, Keith answered. We'll find a good appraiser. If they're worth as much as we think they are, it could change our lives. Ours? I raised an eyebrow. Well, mostly mine and Violet's, Keith admitted without a trace of embarrassment. But you'll get some too. We could pay for a nice nursing home for you. Or a nurse. Violet nodded as if they were offering me the greatest boon of all. Exactly. And we could sell the house. After all, you don't need so much space anymore. I stared at them in silence, not believing my ears. They didn't even try to hide their intentions. In their eyes, I was already written off as an old man living out his days, whose only purpose was to hand over his possessions to them. You barely had enough to pay for dinner, Keith said suddenly with an unpleasant grin, nodding at the check I'd signed. I saw how pale you looked when you saw the amount. Why do I need a father like that? Violet laughed loudly, as if he'd said something witty rather than insulting the parent who'd spent a lifetime caring for him. I felt something inside me snap. Years of patience, years of trying to build a relationship with my son, years of self-deception. It all came crashing down in an instant. That man across from me was no longer my child. He was an outsider, a calculating predator waiting for his prey to weaken. I slowly stood up from the table, feeling the stares of the other customers. You know, Keith, I said quietly but firmly, I've always been proud of the fact that I was able to educate and raise you, even when I was left alone after your mother died. I've never been rich, but I've always tried to teach you to appreciate what's really important in life. Knowledge, kindness, dignity. Apparently, I failed. Keith and Violet looked at me with undisguised surprise. They clearly hadn't expected a rebuff. As for Edmund's collection, I continued, I did meet with an expert. And do you know what he said? Those books are worth a fortune. More than you'll earn in 10 years of your successful career. Keith's eyes widened, and Violet leaned forward, forgetting her pretense of politeness. Solomon, but the interesting thing is that I found out something else. Something you have no idea about, I paused, watching as they froze in anticipation. And that knowledge will change a lot of things. For all of us. I could see their faces turn pale. They didn't know if I was bluffing or not, but something in my tone made them question their plans. What do you mean? Keith asked, and for the first time all evening, there was uncertainty in his voice. Ankron, you'll know soon enough, I said, taking up my cloak. Well, I think I'll be going now. Thank you for inviting me to dinner. It was informative. I headed for the exit, feeling their shocked stares on my back. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of release. It was as if a heavy weight I'd been carrying all my life had suddenly fallen from my shoulders. Maybe I really am a bad father, but I wasn't going to be a victim anymore. Returning home in a cab after a humiliating dinner, I felt a mixture of anger and a strange release inside. Never before had I seen my son and his wife in such a candid light. Their greed, their disdain for me, it had all been obvious before, but that night they didn't even try to hide it. Why do I need a father like that? Those words were still ringing in my ears. How could my own son say such a thing? What had happened to the little boy I had once taught to tie his shoelaces and read his first books? Upon reaching home, I immediately headed for the phone. It was almost 10 o'clock at night. But I knew it wouldn't bother Irene Foster, my former coworker. She had always been a night owl, preferring to work in silence after sunset. Weston? Her voice sounded surprised. AOE, is something wrong? I'm sorry to call you so late, Irene. You said you could help me with the appraisal of Edmund's collection. I'd like to meet as soon as possible. She was quiet for a second, apparently picking up on the tension in my voice. Of course. Have the books arrived yet? No, they'll be delivered next week, but I'd like to prepare in advance to find out more about their value, the possibilities of selling them. Sale? Ashram. She sounded a little surprised. I thought you'd want to keep the collection. I sighed, sinking into the chair. I thought so too, but circumstances have changed. I understand, she said softly. Well, let's meet tomorrow. I work at the store from 11 o'clock. Come and we'll talk about it. After talking to Irene, I couldn't sleep for a long time. My thoughts revolved around Keith, his words, his cruelty. How did we get to this point? Where had I gone wrong as a father? Alma would be disappointed to see what our son had become. The morning brought rain and a headache. I slowly pulled myself together, drank a cup of strong tea, and headed to the antique bookstore where Irene worked. Pages of Time was a small establishment in the old part of town, among narrow streets and historic buildings. The bell above the door jingled melodiously as I entered. The smell of old books and wood immediately enveloped me with a familiar warmth. Everything here breathed history. Dark wooden shelves to the ceiling, cozy armchairs in the corner, the dim light of antique lamps. It was a world I understood and loved. Irene greeted me with a smile. In her 69 years, she retained the vivacity of mind and elegance that had always distinguished her. Her gray hair was gathered into a neat bundle, and her eyes behind her fine-rimmed glasses looked attentive and warm. Weston, my dear, she came over and put her arms around me. You look exhausted. Rough night. A hard night, I admitted, and not the most pleasant of reflections afterward. She nodded understandingly. Let's go to the back room. I've made some tea, and I have something that might interest you. The back room of the store was at once an office, a warehouse, and a place for appraising particularly valuable specimens. A large oak desk took center stage, and along the walls were racks of books awaiting restoration or appraisal. Irene poured tea into antique china cups and pulled a folder from the desk drawer. I did a little research after you called, she said, opening the folder. Edmund Rochester mentioned his collection in several interviews with literary magazines, and if it does include the copies he mentioned, then its value is impressive. She handed me printouts of old interviews. I skimmed through them, stopping at mentions of specific publications. Here, Irene pointed to a paragraph. He talks about a first edition of Keats's Lamia from 1820th, signed by the author. If that's true, that book alone could be worth hundreds of thousands. I looked at her stunned. Hundreds of thousands? For one book? She nodded. Rare first editions signed by the authors are the holy grail for collectors. And given that Keats died young and his autographs are extremely rare, I leaned back in my chair trying to comprehend this information. Hundreds of thousands of dollars for one book, and there are 37 of them in the collection. But that's speculation, Irene continued. We need to wait for the collection to arrive and have each copy professionally appraised. The condition of the book, the presence of any defects, the provenance, all this affects the final cost. Provenance, or I asked? Ownership history. Who owned the book before it came to Edmund? If the previous owners were famous, it could increase the value considerably. I took a sip of tea, feeling my head start to spin from all this information. And what is the process of selling such books? If I decide to sell them, Irene tapped her finger on the table thoughtfully. For a collection of this caliber, I'd recommend an auction. Sotheby's or Christie's. They attract the most serious collectors from all over the world. Commissions are high, but the results are corresponding. Of course, you can also sell privately, but then there is a high risk of being cheap. And how long does it take to sell through an auction? From a few months to 6 months, she said. First the evaluation, then the inclusion in the catalog, promotion. It's not a quick process. I nodded, thinking about it. 6 months. Long enough for Keith to lose patience and interest. But if the result is, as Irene had envisioned, There's another option, Irene said, interrupting my thoughts. If you need money urgently, you could sell a few of the most valuable pieces directly to a serious collector. I know a couple of people who might be interested. The price would be lower than at auction, but the deal could be done within a few weeks. I need to think it over, I said, and wait for the books themselves, of course. Of course, Irene smiled, but there's something else you should know. Collections at this level often attract unwanted attention. If word of your possession of these books spreads, there could be trouble. What kind of trouble? I'm wary. From intrusive dealers offering to buy the collection for next to nothing to more serious trouble. Rare books are not only cultural value, but also a lot of money. And where there's money, there's risk. I remembered the greedy look on Keith and Violet's faces as they talked about books. I understand, I said quietly. I think I need to be careful about who I tell about the inheritance. Irene looked at me carefully. Weston, we've known each other for almost 40 years. I can see that something is troubling you, beyond the valuation and sale issues. Is it something to do with Keith? I sighed. Irene had always been perceptive. We had dinner together last night. He and his wife, they'd made it clear that they viewed me as a liability who happened to benefit them financially, Keith said. I stammered, struggling to say the words. He said he didn't want a father like me. Irene shook her head, her eyes filled with sympathy. I'm sorry, Weston. It's cruel and unfair. I always knew our relationship wasn't perfect, I continued. But yesterday a certain point of no return was reached. And now I'm thinking, maybe it's time to live for myself, to use these books to ensure a comfortable old age, rather than worrying about an inheritance for a son who despises me. I think it's absolutely the right decision, Irene said firmly. You deserve a quiet and dignified life. And if these books can give you that, that's fine. After all, Edmund left them to you, not Keith. Her words gave me confidence. Yes, Edmund left the books to me. He knew that I valued them not only as material objects, but also as a treasure trove of human thought and creativity. Knew that I would treat them with respect, whether I decided to keep them or sell them. Thank you, Irene, I said, shaking her hand. Edwin, you've always been able to bring clarity to my confused thoughts. That's what friends are for, she smiled. Now let's see what other treasures might be in Edmund's collection. We spent the next 2 hours studying interviews and articles that mentioned the Rochester collection. The picture became more and more impressive. In addition to first editions of Keats, Byron, and Shelley, the collection could contain rare copies of works by Tennyson, Browning, and other Victorian poets. Some with gift inscriptions, some from the personal libraries of famous historical figures. If all of this is true, Irene concluded when we finished our tour, the total value of the collection could be several $1,000,000. I felt my breath catch. Millions. An amount I couldn't even imagine. A sum that could have completely changed my life. What do you advise me to do when the books arrive? I asked. First, secure them, Irene answered without hesitation. Hire a safe deposit box or a safe deposit box. Second, contact a professional appraiser. I can recommend a couple of very good ones. Third, think about insurance. Such valuables should be protected against all possible risks. I nodded, making mental notes. What about Keith? I asked. He knows about the inheritance, but not its true value. And judging by his behavior yesterday, he won't stop trying to get his hands on that money. Irene frowned. Oh, you're not legally obligated to tell him your plans or share the proceeds of the sale. The books are your property, and you have the right to dispose of them as you see fit. But if you're worried about, trouble, you might want to consult a lawyer. Do you think it might come to that? She shrugged. I don't know Keith as well as you do, but from what you've told me, he and his wife are very interested in money, and people driven by greed can do a lot of things. Her words made me think. Really, how far would Keith go in his quest for a piece of the inheritance? He had always been ambitious and not too scrupulous in his choice of means to achieve his goals. But could he have crossed any line? I'll think about it, I said, rising. Thank you for everything, Irene. You've been a great help. You're welcome. She stood up too. Keep me informed when the books arrive. I'd like to take a look at them. Purely out of academic interest, of course. I smiled sincerely for the first time in days. Of course. When I left the store, I didn't go home, but to the bank. I needed to inquire about the possibility of renting a safe deposit box. If the books were really worth millions, I couldn't risk keeping them at home, especially given Keith and Violet's interest. The bank explained the terms of the rental and showed me the available safe deposit boxes of different sizes. I chose the middle one, big enough for the books, but not too expensive. The rent was $50 a month, which was reasonable for my budget, especially with the prospect of future income. After signing the contract and receiving the key, I was somewhat relieved. At least the books would be safe once they arrived. The next item on my plan was a lawyer. Irene had mentioned the possible need for consultation, and I decided not to put it off. An acquaintance of mine, Gerald Hawkins, had once been a student at the college where I taught. He now had his own law practice, specializing in real estate and inheritance matters. Gerald received me without an appointment, greeting me warmly and reminiscing about old times. When we got down to business, I presented the situation as objectively as possible, trying not to emphasize personal grievances. "So," Gerald summarized when I finished, "you have a valuable collection of books that you plan to sell. Your son knows about the inheritance but not its exact value, and is taking a keen interest in it. Do you want to know your rights and responsibilities in this situation?" "Exactly," I nodded. Legally it's quite simple," Gerald said. "These books are your personal property. You have the right to dispose of them as you see fit, sell them, donate them, bequeath them to whomever you wish. You don't have to inform your son of your decisions or share the proceeds of the sale with him. What if he finds out about the sale and demands his share? Is there anything he can do legally?" Gerald shook his head. "As long as you are alive and legally capable, he has no rights to your property. Of course, after your death, if there is no will, he will receive all your property as the sole heir. But now, no, he has no legal grounds to claim a share in your property." I'm relieved. "What would you advise me to do?" "First, make a will if you don't already have one," Gerald replied, "especially given the new circumstances. Secondly, keep careful records of all financial transactions related to the sale of books. Third, if you fear conflict, it may be worth considering a trust or other financial structure to manage the proceeds of the sale." "A trust," I interjected. It sounded too complicated for someone who had lived on a professor's salary all his life. "Yes, it's a tool that allows you to protect your assets and manage them in a certain way," Gerald explained. "But it only makes sense for significant sums. If an appraisal of the books confirms their high value, we can revisit the subject." I nodded, feeling a little dizzy from all this information. Trusts, millions, auctions, it was all so far removed from my normal life. "Thank you, Gerald. I'll think about what you said and contact you when the books arrive and are appraised." "I'll be waiting." He shook my hand. "And Professor, if I may offer some personal advice, don't let family relationships dictate your financial decisions. Money can be a powerful tool, but it can also destroy even the strongest of bonds." His words made me think. Money. How much would they change my life? How much had they already changed my relationship with my son? If Edmund hadn't left me this collection, would I have continued to endure the humiliation from Keith and Violet, hoping for some miraculous reconciliation? Leaving Gerald's office, I walked slowly down the street, immersed in thought. The spring day was in full swing, and people were going about their business, oblivious to the elderly man who had just learned that he might soon be a millionaire. A millionaire. The word seemed so foreign, so inapplicable to me. All my life I lived modestly, counting every dollar, saving for a rainy day. And now fate has given me this gift. What am I going to do with this money? The first thought, of course, is about security and comfort in old age. Health insurance that would cover all possible expenses. Perhaps a move to a more comfortable home, without the stairs that were becoming more problematic for my knees each year. Household help, not a full-time caregiver, as Keith and Violet had suggested, but someone who would come in a few times a week to help with cleaning and cooking. But money could provide other opportunities. Travel, for example. I had always dreamed of seeing Greece, the cradle of philosophy, and Italy with its countless art treasures. It used to seem like a pipe dream, but now, and books. I could build up a collection of my own. Not as valuable as Edmund's, of course, but made up of the editions I'd always wanted. The first edition of Darwin's Origin of Species Darwin, which I saw once at an exhibition and couldn't take my eyes off. Or the complete works of Shakespeare in an antique leather binding. The possibilities seemed endless, and it was intoxicating. But at the same time, I felt a strange anxiety. Would this money change me? Would I turn into someone like Keith and Violet, for whom material possessions had become more important than human relationships? No, I decided, I wouldn't let that happen. Money is a tool, as Gerald said. A tool to provide a decent life, to realize long-held dreams, to help those who need it. But above all, it's a tool for independence. Independence from Keith, from his ostentatious concern, which always had ulterior motives. Independence from fear of the future, from the need to economize on the essentials. With these thoughts in mind, I returned home and sat down at the computer. I needed to write a reply to Roland Pierce, confirming my willingness to accept Edmund's collection, and start planning my new life, the life of a man who had finally found freedom of choice. It was a week after my conversation with Irene and my visit to the solicitor. During that time, I had time to consider many options for my future, but I hadn't made a final decision yet. The books were due to arrive any day now, and I was in a state of nervous anticipation. Tuesday morning started as usual, with a cup of tea and a look at the morning paper. Around 10 o'clock, the phone rang. I thought it was the courier with the collection, but it was Keith on the other end of the line. "Dad," his voice sounded unnaturally cheerful. "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," I answered guardedly, still remembering our last conversation at the restaurant. "Listen, I was thinking, maybe I should come over to your place tonight, help you with something around the house. You haven't changed the filters in your air conditioner in a while, and summer's coming." I couldn't help but chuckle. Keith had never once offered to help around the house in the last 5 years. And now all of a sudden he's so concerned. "Thank you, but I'm doing fine on my own," I replied. "Besides, I have business in town today." "Business?" He sounded surprised. "What kind of business?" "Meeting some old friends," I lied. I was actually waiting for a book delivery, and I didn't want Keith around at that moment. Well, maybe tomorrow then? Or the weekend? Violet made you some homemade cookies. She says you need to eat better." Violet made cookies? The same Violet who once proudly proclaimed she didn't know where the kitchen was in their house? This was getting interesting. "I'm going to be busy this weekend," I said, "but thanks for the offer." "Dad," Keith sounded annoyed, "Violet and I just want to help. After that dinner, well, you know, we feel awkward." "Awkward," I repeated. Interesting word. "Look, I was wrong, okay?" His tone became almost pleading. "I said too much. Let's just forget about it. We're family after all." Family. Not so long ago, that word might have moved me, made me want to make concessions. But not now. Not after everything I've heard and realized lately. "Keith, I'm on another call right now," I lied. "Let's talk later." Without waiting for his response, I hung up. Less than an hour later, the doorbell rang. To my surprise, Violet stood on the doorstep with a basket covered with a plaid napkin. "Weston!" She broke out into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I was driving by and thought I'd stop by. Brought you some homemade cookies. Oatmeal with raisins. Very good for, people your age." I stared at her, not hiding my surprise. Violet, dressed for a glossy magazine photo shoot with perfect makeup and manicure, claimed to have driven by my house, which was on the opposite side of town from their apartment. "Thank you, Violet, but I'm allergic to raisins," I replied, even though it wasn't true. "Oh," her smile twitched slightly. "I didn't know, but I can come in for a cup of tea. It's been so long since we've spoken." "We've never spoken," I thought, but said aloud, "Unfortunately, I was just about to leave. There's a meeting in town." "A meeting?" She raised a perfectly plucked eyebrow. "With who?" "Friends," I answered shortly. "Maybe I could give you a ride? I have just the time." Violet's insistence was getting annoying. "No, thanks. I prefer public transportation." She looked over my shoulder into the hallway. She assured me, "Everything okay in here? Keith is worried about you living alone in such a big house. It could be dangerous." "I've lived here for 40 years, Violet, and I've managed so far," I said firmly. "Tell Keith that his concern is misplaced." "Sure, sure." She smiled that fake smile again. "By the way, those books you were talking about, Have they arrived yet? That's it. The real reason for the visit. Not yet, I answered honestly. Sonim, but I'm really late, Violet. I took my coat and hat, signaling defiantly that the conversation was over. Violet reluctantly backed away. All right, I won't keep you, but at least take a cookie. Allergies, remember, I reminded her, closing the door behind me. I did go into town, though I didn't have an appointment. I just wanted to make sure Violet wasn't hanging around the house waiting for the books to be delivered. I spent a few hours in the library rereading my favorite Yeats poems and pondering the strange twists of fate that had brought me to this moment. When I returned home in the evening, I found 3 messages from Keith on my answering machine, each more insistent than the last. In the last one, he bluntly asked if the books had already arrived and if I needed my help with their appraisal and preservation. I erased all the messages and turned off my phone. I needed to think. The next day, the books finally arrived. 2 solid uniformed couriers delivered 6 carefully packed crates. They helped carry them into the house and even offered to unpack them, but I politely declined. I wanted to be alone with Edmund's inheritance. As soon as the couriers left, I called Irene. They're here, I said, not hiding my excitement. 6 cases. I'll be there in an hour, she answered without further question. While I waited for Irene, I decided to examine at least one of the boxes. Carefully opening the packaging, I saw the books wrapped in acid-free paper and placed in special storage containers. Edmund had always been reverent about his collection. I pulled out the first volume, a small book in a dark green leather binding. Poems written and published by George Gordon, Lord Byron, read the inscription on the title page. London, 1817. Carefully turning the fragile pages, I felt a sense of awe. This book was over 200 years old. It had seen the birth and death of generations, witnessed historical events, experienced wars and revolutions. And now it was in my hands, the material embodiment of Byron's genius. The doorbell interrupted my musings. Irene arrived, accompanied by an elderly man with a neat gray beard. Weston, this is Harrison Phelps, she introduced her companion, one of the best rare book experts in the country. I thought his opinion would be helpful. We settled into the living room and spent the next few hours scrutinizing every book in the first drawer. Harrison worked with white gloves, a magnifying glass, and special tools to measure and assess the condition of the bindings and pages. Extraordinary, he repeated, moving from one volume to the next. The condition is almost flawless. Provenance impeccable. This is one of the finest private collections I've ever seen. By evening, we had only examined the contents of 2 of the 6 boxes, but it was already clear that Edmund's collection exceeded all expectations. Some of the books Harrison valued at 6 figures each one. The total value, he said, taking off his gloves, is hard to say for sure without a full catalog, but I'd tentatively estimate $3 or $4 million. Probably more with the right sales approach. I sat stunned by that figure. 3 to 4 million, more than I'd made in my entire life. What should I do with them now? I asked, looking at the book treasures spread out on the table. I wouldn't recommend keeping them here, Harrison replied. A normal house doesn't provide the proper conditions for preserving such valuables: humidity control, temperature control, protection from light, not to mention security. I've rented a safe deposit box, I said, but it won't hold all the books. There are specialized storage facilities for art and collections, Irene suggested. They provide all the necessary conditions and have serious security. It's not cheap, but considering the value of the collection, I can recommend a couple of reliable places, Harrison added, and help with transportation. It's a delicate process. We agreed that the next day, Harrison would arrange for the books to be transported to a specialized repository and begin the process of fully cataloging and appraising the collection. I signed the necessary paperwork and wrote a check for a down payment for his services. The amount was impressive, but it was a necessary expense to protect my new wealth. When Irene and Harrison left, I sat in my chair, trying to make sense of what had happened. There had been a drastic change in my life, and I wasn't yet fully aware of how to deal with it. The doorbell rang again, snapping me out of my thoughts. Keith stood on the doorstep with a bottle of wine and a strained smile. "Dad, I thought I'd stop by and check on you. How are you?" I looked at him, feeling strangely detached. Only a few weeks ago, I would have been glad to see such a visit, to see in it hope for the restoration of our relationship. Now all I saw was falsity and self-interest. "Tonight's not a good night for a visit, Keith," I said. "I'm very tired." "Oh," he tried to look over my shoulder. "Did you have company? I saw the car drive away." "Yes, some friends stopped by." "Friends?" He looked surprised. "What friends?" "Old colleagues," I answered evasively. I hadn't seen them in a while. Keith shuffled from foot to foot, clearly reluctant to leave. "Listen, Dad, about those books. Have they arrived yet?" "No," I lied. "There was a delay in delivery." "When are they due?" "I'm not sure. Maybe next week." He seemed disappointed. "Well, let me know when they arrive. I'll help you deal with them. You know, Violet has a friend in the antique world. He might be able to—" "Thanks, Keith, but I've already arranged with an expert," I interrupted him. "Everything's under control." "An expert?" His eyes narrowed. "What expert?" "A professional rare book appraiser. Irene recommended him." "Irene? You mean Irene Foster? That old girl from your college?" I could feel the irritation rising inside me. "Irene is a respected antiquarian book expert. And yes, she worked with me in college. But I would ask you not to use such outdated and offensive terms as old maid." "Okay, okay." Keith held up his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "I'm just surprised you didn't come to me for help. After all, I am your son." "Yes, you are," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "And I remember everything you said to me at dinner at the restaurant." Keith had at least the conscience to look embarrassed. "Dad," I apologized. "It was a rough day. I had too much to drink." "You know that's not what I meant." "Do I?" I asked quietly. "Keith, it's late. Let's talk some other time." "But another time," I repeated firmly, closing the door. I walked back into the living room, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and determination. Maybe deep down, I still hoped that our relationship could be salvaged. That beneath the mask of greed and coldness, there was something of the little boy I'd once loved more than life left in Keith. But with each visit, with each conversation, that hope faded. The next morning, Harrison arrived with 2 assistants and a specially equipped van. They carefully packed all the books and loaded them for transportation to the vault. I kept only one volume, a first edition of Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, my favorite poem. Harrison promised to provide a complete catalog of the collection in a week, with an appraisal of each book and recommendations for sale. After they left, the house seemed strangely empty. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The day was warm and sunny, perfect for a spring walk. I headed to a small park nearby, where I used to walk a lot in the old days. The park wasn't crowded. A couple of young moms with strollers, a few elderly people on benches, boys playing with a ball on the lawn. I settled down on a vacant bench and pulled out the Keats tome I'd brought with me. "Keats?" came a voice nearby. "A lovely choice for a spring day." I looked up and saw an older woman with short gray hair and lively brown eyes. She pointed to the seat next to me. "Do you mind if I sit down?" "Of course not," I replied, moving over. "I'm Eleanor Pratt," she introduced herself, sitting down. "But everyone just calls me Nora." "Weston Pemberton." I held out my hand, which she shook firmly. "Shukikuni. Do you come here often, Weston? I live across the street and walk in this park almost every day, but I don't remember seeing you before." "I used to," I answered, "but in recent years, less often." "I understand," she nodded. "We change habits as we get older. But I think daily walks are essential. Keeps the body toned and clears the mind." We got to talking. Nora turned out to be a former doctor, a pediatrician who had retired 5 years ago. She was a widow like me and had 2 grown children living in other cities. "They call every Sunday," she said with a smile. "They come for the holidays. But they have their own lives, and it's the right thing to do." "Don't you feel lonely?" I asked, thinking of my own situation. "Sometimes," Nora admitted. "But I've found ways to combat the loneliness. Volunteering at the local library, art classes, book club. You know, at our age, it's important to stay active and open to new experiences." Her words got me thinking. When was the last time I did something new? Tried a new hobby, met new people. For too long, I'd lived in my own little world, confined to the walls of the house and the occasional, usually unpleasant, visits from Keith and Violet. "Our book club meets Thursdays at the library," Nora continued. If you're interested, come along. This month we're discussing romantic poetry, so your Keats will be very useful. I agreed, surprised at my decision. We exchanged phone numbers, and Nora promised to let me know the exact time of the next club meeting. When I got home, I found 3 more messages on my answering machine from Keith, one from Violet and one from the courier service confirming delivery of the collection. I erased all but the last one. The next day I got a call from Keith. "Dad, I just got a call from the courier service." His voice sounded excited. "Saruwapan. They confirmed the delivery of the books yesterday. Why did you say they haven't arrived yet?" I sighed. Keith was obviously trying to track the delivery through the courier service. "Because it's none of your business, Keith," I answered bluntly. "What?" He sounded shocked. "Dad, we're talking about a valuable collection. Of course it's my business. I'm your son, your heir." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," I said calmly. "Wachtinoman, you see me only as a source of inheritance. But I'm still alive, Keith, and the books are my property, not yours. Have you sold them yet?" There was a note of panic in his voice. "Not yet, but I'm working on it. Dad, you can't just sell the collection without consulting me." He was practically screaming. "This is a family decision." "No, Keith," I said firmly. "It's my decision, my property, my life. But what about me? Violet? Our plans?" "Your plans are your business. My money is mine. That's the way the world works, Keith." "I can't believe you're doing this." His voice shook with anger. "After everything we've done for you." "What exactly have you done for me, Keith?" I asked quietly. "Visited me once every few months? Offered to send me to a nursing home? Humiliated me at a dinner I paid for myself?" There was a long pause. "It was all that, Irene, wasn't it?" Keith finally spoke up. "She's turning you against me. Or that expert. They want your money?" I shook my head tiredly, though he couldn't see it. "No one's turning anyone against anyone, Keith. I'm just finally seeing the situation for what it is." "We'll talk about this later," he said sharply, "when you're in a more sane." He hung up without saying goodbye. I expected this conversation to leave me upset, perhaps even depressed. But instead I felt strangely relieved. For the first time in years, I had spoken my thoughts openly without fear of offending my son, without trying to maintain the appearance of a normal relationship. On Thursday, I went to the book club meeting, as I had promised Nora. There were about 15 people of all ages, from students to retirees, gathered in the library's small hall. I was warmly welcomed, and the discussion of romantic poetry was lively and interesting. For the first time in many years, I felt in my element, discussing literature with enthusiastic people. After the meeting, Nora introduced me to other members of the club. Among them was Robert Mason, a former history professor with whom we had many common interests, and Sarah Johnson, an energetic woman my age who ran the local community garden. "We always need volunteers," Sarah said when she learned that I love gardening, "especially people who know how to handle roses. Our rose garden is in a sorry state." I agreed to help, and we arranged to meet in the garden on Saturday morning. So, unexpectedly, I found myself involved in a new social life I didn't even know existed. The book club, the community garden, new acquaintances, all of these things gave my days the meaning I had been missing for so long. Harrison called twice, reporting on the progress of cataloging and grading. The news was good. Some copies turned out to be even more valuable than originally thought. He also contacted representatives of Sotheby's and Christie's, and both auction houses expressed interest in organizing special bidding for the Rochester collection. Keith called several times over the days, but I didn't answer. Violet arrived twice unannounced, but I didn't answer the door. I wasn't ready for another round of manipulation and phony displays of concern. On Saturday, while working in the community garden under Sarah's supervision, I felt the phone in my pocket vibrate. Wiping my hands on my apron, I checked the message. It was Irene. "Weston, I just got a call from your son. He was asking about the collection and about you. He was very persistent. I didn't tell him anything, but I think you should know." I sighed. Keith clearly wasn't going to back down. But that didn't bother me now. The books were safe in a vault that only me, Irene, and Harrison knew about. A plan to sell them was in the works. and I was finally getting on with my life. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked, noticing my pensive expression. "Yes," I replied with a smile, going back to pruning the roses. "Better than ever." And it was true. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a lonely old man living out his days, waiting for his son's rare visits, but a man with a future, with new opportunities, with friends who valued me for who I was, not for a potential inheritance. The auction at Sotheby's exceeded expectations. The Edmund Rochester collection was billed as one of the most important private collections of first editions of 19th century British poetry. An elegant catalog with color photographs of each book went around the world, attracting the attention of serious collectors and institutional buyers. I attended the auction, accompanied by Irene and Harrison. We sat in the front row, watching books that had recently been part of my friend's inheritance go to new owners for sums that made my head spin. A first edition of Keats's Lamia, signed by the author, went for $780,000 after a fierce bidding war between a Japanese collector and a representative of the British Library. Lord Byron's poems brought $450,000. By the end of the day, the total sales amounted to $4,600,000, far more than the preliminary estimate. "Congratulations, Weston," Irene said as we left the auction room. "You are now officially a millionaire." The word still sounded strange when applied to me. Millionaire. I, a humble philosophy professor, a man who used to make every dollar count, was suddenly the owner of a fortune I'd never even dreamed of. After paying commissions to the auction house, taxes, and all related expenses, I had about $3,200,000 in my account, money that would completely change the rest of my life. On the advice of Gerald Hawkins, I set up a trust to manage these funds. Some of the money was invested in a conservative portfolio that would provide a steady income. The other part went to buy a small but comfortable apartment in a good neighborhood, on the first floor, with wheelchair access should the need ever arise. I also made a few donations to the local library for the development of its rare editions department, to the community garden where I continued to volunteer, and to a small scholarship fund for philosophy students at my former college. But most importantly, I found freedom. Freedom from worrying about the future, from having to save money on medicine or heating, from depending on Keith and his fake care. All this time, I avoided contact with my son and his wife. They kept calling and visiting, but I didn't respond to their attempts to contact me. I knew there would inevitably be a moment of confrontation, especially when they learned of the sale of the collection, but I tried to delay it as long as possible. That moment came on a sunny afternoon in early July, 2 weeks after the auction. I had just returned from a community garden where Sarah and I and other volunteers were working on a new arrangement of roses when I saw a familiar car in front of my house. Keith was standing on the porch, ringing the doorbell furiously. "Dad!" He turned around when he saw me. "Finally! I've been trying to call you for 2 weeks." "Hello, Keith." I walked calmly to the door, pulling out my keys. "As you can see, I'm alive and well. Is that true?" He blocked my way, preventing me from opening the door. "What I heard about the auction? You sold all the books?" Then he already knew. No wonder the information about the auction wasn't a secret, and Edmund Rochester was a well-known name in academic circles. "Yes," I answered simply. "The collection had been sold at the Sotheby's auction 2 weeks ago." Keith's face contorted with anger and disbelief. You did this without me? Without consulting me?" "Without," he hesitated, searching for words. "Without considering the family's interests?" "I was acting in my own best interest, Keith," I said, stepping around him and opening the door. "The books were my property, but the money—" He followed me into the house. "How much did you get?" I heard it was millions. I put my gardening gloves and hat on the hall table and headed for the kitchen. I wanted a drink of water after working in the garden. "I don't think it's any of your business, Keith." "None of my business?" he almost shouted, following me at my heels. "I'm your son. Your blood." "Of course it's my business." I poured myself a glass of water and turned to him. "Being my son doesn't entitle you to my property, Keith. Not in my lifetime." "But it's not fair." He pounded his fist on the tabletop. "You're an old man. What are you going to do with that kind of money? You have what, 10 years of life left? 15 at best. Violet and I have our whole lives ahead of us. We were planning. I remember your plans, I interrupted him. A house in the suburbs, maybe kids. That's very touching, especially since you were planning to put me in a nursing home and sell the house. Keith blushed but didn't give up. That was just talk. We care about you. Violet baked those cookies on purpose, even though she doesn't cook at all. Yeah, with raisins, which I'm supposedly allergic to, I said dryly. Very thoughtful. It was a mistake, he exclaimed. Nobody's perfect, Dad. We tried. We really tried to make things work. And you ruined everything with your stubbornness and suspicion. I took a sip of water, feeling the anger rising inside, but holding it back. Keith, let's be honest. You only became interested in my life when you found out about the inheritance. Before that, I saw you once every few months, and every visit was accompanied by hints about how you and Violet needed money and how I should plan for my future. That's not true, he protested, but his eyes were running, avoiding a direct stare. It's the absolute truth, and we both know it, I said firmly. That's why I've made my decision. The money from the book sales is mine. I will use it to provide myself with a decent old age, without having to rely on your care. Keith looked at me with a look of disbelief that gradually changed to rage. You can't do that. I won't let you. I'm afraid it's too late. I put the empty glass in the sink. The money has already been transferred to a trust that I and my appointed trustees manage. You have no access to it. Trust? His voice hit a high note. You set up a trust without me? That's willful disinheritance. No, Keith, I shook my head. It's called disposition of one's own estate. I consulted a lawyer. It's perfectly legal. He stood there, breathing hard, his fists clenching and unclenching. You're going to regret this, he finally said. We'll sue. We'll prove that you're incompetent, that Irene manipulated you for her own gain. I grinned. Good luck with that, Keith. I have medical reports of full capacity, testimony from respected experts in antiquarian books and finance, and, most importantly, documentary evidence of your true intentions, starting with that night at the restaurant. What kind of proof? He looked confused. I've been recording our conversations, Keith, including the one where you explicitly said you didn't want a father like me, and the one where you and Violet discussed how to sell my house after you put me in a good nursing home. That was a lie. I didn't record our conversations, but Keith didn't know that, and his face turned pale. You couldn't. It's illegal. In the state of Texas, it's enough for one party to know about the recording. I bluffed, but it sounded convincing. But even if the recordings were illegal, they would still show the true nature of your intentions. And that was all I needed to make a decision. Keith sat down at the kitchen table, wrapping his arms around his head. I can't believe you're doing this to me, with your own family. Family isn't just blood ties, Keith, I said quietly. It's respect, caring, support. I haven't seen any of that from you in years. At that moment, the front door opened and Violet walked in. She looked as impeccable as ever, but her usual composure was clearly compromised. Keith? Weston? What's going on? She walked quickly over to her husband, placing a hand on his shoulder. Why aren't you answering the phone? He knows, Keith said deftly, about the books, about the money. He sold everything without us and set up some kind of trust. Violet turned sharply toward me, her eyes narrowed. Is it true? Did you really do it? Yes, Violet, I answered calmly. And I don't have to answer to you about my financial decisions. You selfish old... She hesitated for a word, but held back. Keith is your only son. He deserves to know about these decisions, to be a part of them. Deserves? I raised an eyebrow. How exactly does he deserve it, Violet? By visiting me once every few months, or humiliating me in front of you in a restaurant? That was an isolated incident, she exclaimed. Keith apologized. We were both trying to make things work and you just pushing us away. I shook my head, feeling tired of this conversation. Violet, let's not pretend. You two only became interested in me when you found out about the inheritance. Before that, I was a burden to you, an old man who has lived too long in a house you had already mentally sold. It's not fair, her voice rose. We've always cared for you. Really? I looked her straight in the eye. Then name my favorite dish, or a book, or a movie. Name something personal about me that doesn't involve my possessions or my health. Violet opened her mouth but didn't utter a word. She looked helplessly at Keith, but he too was silent, staring at the floor. Exactly, I said quietly. You know nothing about me as a person. I'm not your father or father-in-law. I'm an obstacle between you and my money. That's not true, Keith began, but his voice sounded unconvincing. Keith, I walked over to him, putting my hand on his shoulder. I loved you. I always have. And part of me still loves the little boy you once were. But the man you've become, I don't know him, and I'm not sure I want to. He looked up, tears glistening in his eyes, whether from hurt or anger. I couldn't tell. What are you saying? I'm saying that a relationship needs two sides, Keith, and I don't want to be a part of this fake one anymore. I'm no longer going to pretend that we have a normal father-son relationship when in reality, you're only waiting for me to die and inherit. How dare you? Violet intervened. After all we have done. What have you done, Violet? I interrupted. Did you bring me raisin cookies? Did you offer to sell my house? Reminded me how many years I have left? She backed away, clearly not expecting such a rebuff. Weston, you don't understand. I understand perfectly well, I said firmly. And I've made a decision. I've sold the house. I'm moving into a new apartment at the end of the month. You sold the house? Keith jumped to his feet. Without consulting me? This house. I grew up here. And I left it the first chance I got, I reminded him. Never took any interest in its condition, never helped with repairs even when I asked. And now it's suddenly important to you? Keith stood breathing hard, his face red with anger. It's all because of that money. It changed you, made you cruel, vengeful. I shook my head. No, Keith, the money just gave me the freedom to be honest. Freedom to stop being afraid of your disapproval, your disdain. Freedom to live my life without having to please you in the hope of getting crumbs of attention. And now what? Violet asked, crossing her arms over her chest. You're just going to cut us out of your life, your only son, your family? I'm not cutting Keith out of my life, I replied. I'm just stopping claiming a relationship that doesn't exist. If someday he wants a real relationship based on mutual respect rather than waiting for an inheritance, my door will be open. What about the money? Keith asked bluntly. What will happen to it? After you. Even now, in the midst of this painful conversation, his thoughts were on money. I've made a will, I answered. Some of the money will go to charity, educational programs for underprivileged students, libraries, community gardens. Some to my new friends who have shown more genuine interest in me in a few months than you have in decades. What about me? His voice trembled. To you, Keith, I leave enough for you to never need, but not enough for you to never work. I looked him straight in the eye. And these funds will be paid monthly, in small amounts, through a trust. You'll never get it all at once. Violet made a sound like a stifled sob. It's humiliating. It's like he's some kind of dependent, unable to manage his own money. It's my decision, Violet, I said calmly. And my last word. Keith looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. A mixture of anger, resentment, distrust, and perhaps a tiny bit of understanding. You're going to regret this, he said at last. When you're alone, with your money and your new friends who only want your fortune. I smiled, but without joy. Perhaps, but it will be my choice, Keith. My choices and my mistakes, for the first time in years. They left shortly afterward, Violet throwing angry glances, Keith with slumped shoulders and a lost expression. I stood at the window watching their car pull away and felt a strange mixture of sadness and release. Something had ended today, a long chapter of my life filled with hope, disappointment, and self-delusion. But something was also beginning, a new chapter that I could write by my own rules. The move to the new apartment went smoothly. I took with me only the things dearest to my heart, pictures of Alma, some books, a few pieces of furniture with history. The rest I either sold or gave to charity. The new place was bright, spacious, and comfortable, with wide doorways, no thresholds, and handrails in the bathroom. Prudent, considering my age. Keith hadn't tried to contact me since our last conversation. Neither had Violet. I knew from mutual acquaintances that they had moved to another city where Keith had gotten a new job. Maybe it was for the best. The geographical distance added to the emotional one. My new life turned out to be full and fulfilling. I continued to participate in the book club, volunteered at the community garden, and even began teaching philosophy at the local senior center. Not for money, but for the pleasure of sharing knowledge. Nora became a close friend of mine. We often went to concerts together, to museums, or just walked in the park. Gradually, our friendship grew into something more. A quiet, calm feeling that warmed my soul and made every day brighter. I didn't think that after Alma I could experience such feelings, but life is full of surprises. In October, Nora and I decided to fulfill a long-time dream, a trip to Greece. For 2 weeks, we wandered around ancient ruins, enjoyed the azure sea and local cuisine, talked about philosophy and art. In Athens, standing at the Parthenon, I suddenly realized how much my life had changed. Just 6 months ago, I was a lonely old man counting the days until retirement and enduring humiliation from my own son. Now I was standing on top of the Acropolis, next to a woman who understood and appreciated me, free from financial worries and toxic relationships. After returning from Greece, I received an email from Keith, my first contact in months. It was short and understated. He wrote that he had been thinking a lot about our last conversation, that he had begun working with a therapist on his money and relationship problems. He didn't ask for forgiveness directly, but between the lines, he read some kind of realization of his mistakes. At the end, he asked if he could call me sometime. I thought long and hard about the answer. Part of me still loved Keith, not the greedy man he'd become, but the child I'd raised, the boy with bright eyes and a genuine smile. Could I have given him another chance? Was it worth it? I finally wrote a short reply. Yes, you can call. I'll listen. The rest will be up to you. I didn't know if he would call. I didn't know if it was possible to restore even a semblance of a real relationship between us. But I was open to the possibility, not out of desperation or loneliness, not out of fear of being without a family in my old age, but from a position of strength and freedom of choice. My life now belonged to me, with all its joys and sorrows, opportunities and limitations. I was no longer a passive observer, waiting for attention from those who did not want to give it. I was the author of my story, and the last chapter of that story promised to be the most vivid and intense. In my new office, among the books I could finally afford to buy without looking at the budget, stood a picture of Alma. Sometimes I thought she looked at me with approval. "You've finally done it, Weston," her smile seemed to say. "You've finally started living for yourself." And it was true. At 73, after decades of sacrifice and compromise, I had finally found what most people take for granted, the right to live my life, by my own rules, surrounded by people who value you for who you are, not for what you can give them.